This B Podcast Network show is presented by IXL. IXL's all-inclusive online teaching and learning platform simplifies edtech needs and accelerates achievement in 95 of the top 100 U.S. school districts. IXL delivers personalized learning across a comprehensive pre-K to 12 curriculum, including math, language arts, science, and social studies, and it helps you assess student performance through actionable real-time insights at every level of your school or district. This one solution performs work that typically requires dozens of different tools. Want to find out why so many leading districts trust IXL? Visit ixl.com/BE. That's ixl.com/BE. Welcome in, everybody. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for joining us. We're pleased to have you here for another episode that is part of our National Literacy Month campaign, a partnership we're doing here at the B Podcast Network with Reading is Fundamental, in which we're hosting a number of productive conversations across our network of podcasts about developing kids' reading and literacy skills for life. We're looking at it with researchers, practitioners, authors, parents, and many more, and really dissecting all the different things that we can think about in instilling a joy of reading, reading engagement, building the foundational skills for reading, writing, and other forms of literacy. And I have a great guest today to discuss it. My guest is Karen Gazith. Karen received her PhD in Education and Counselling Psychology from McGill University, and she has taught at McGill for over 2 decades. She also serves as the Graduate Program Director of the Certificate in Inclusive Education in the same department, and as a liaison to the Office of First Nations and Inuit Education and the Department of Integrated Studies and Education at McGill. She has a book called The Power of Effective Reading Instruction: How Neuroscience Informs Instruction Across All Grades and Disciplines. We're going to be talking all about that today. Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. And I should mention my first book that I'm also proud of, which is The Power of Effective Instruction.
Excellent. Yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot of relationship between them, and it's, there's something we've talked about: science of reading. We've certainly talked about joy of reading, reading engagement, making books accessible, but the neuroscience aspect is something we haven't talked about yet. So let's start there, since that's unique to your background. What does the neuroscience research say about how children learn to read?
So we'll make it brief because, probably go on for a very long time. But there's a couple of key things that I think teachers and parents need to know. One is there aren't multiple highways for kids to learn how to read. There's this belief that you can learn using whole language, balanced literacy, or, focusing on phonics. There really is one pathway to reading. Kids, must have a strong phonemic background and develop phonics. They have to learn how to map the letter to the sound. If they do, then they could fully enjoy the pleasures of reading. So the pathway of, again, first they have to be able to break a word into its sounds, then they have to be able to map the sounds onto the letters. There's a particular part of the brain responsible for that. It's the parietal temporal lobe of the left hemisphere. That's the part of the brain that enables us to break those sounds apart and then eventually map them. Reading is not natural from an evolutionary perspective. It's relatively new. We say about 5,000 years old. So that's new in evolutionary terms. And for that reason, there is no part of the brain specifically tasked with reading. So the brain has had to sort of borrow, we say, do what's called neurorecycling, or borrow parts of the brain that are targeted or primed for language. So language is natural. You just have to expose a child to a language and they will speak. But reading, for the reasons I mentioned, is not natural. And therefore, kids must learn how to read, again, break words into their parts, and eventually map them onto the sounds. And kids with effective reading instruction will learn how to read. Some kids will struggle more than others. We have to make sure that we identify those who are at risk and support them very early on, again, because reading is not natural. It must be taught and it must be learned.
Yeah. And you write in the book that teaching students to read is the most essential duty of schools. And also that reading is everyone's business in the
Yeah,
school, that it's not just the domain of the literacy teacher.
exactly.
Can you talk a little more about that? About, why reading is so foundational to make it
Sure.
the number one priority, and why everybody in the school needs to be involved.
Sure. It's funny, I was going to name the book No Teacher is Off the Hook,
Mhm.
and then we decided that maybe that wasn't the best title, but at the end of the day, no teacher is off the hook. So, starting from when the child is born, basically, where they're developing that ability to recognize language and how language is broken into parts. And then when they move into sort of, early nursery, kindergarten, grade one and grade two, they're learning how to read. Reading instruction in almost all school environments ends by the end of grade two, maybe by the end of grade three. So kids are actually learning how to read, that mapping. And then from basically grade three on, they have to read to learn. They require the ability to read in order to glean information in all areas. It's almost like the gateway, the door that opens so that they could fully enjoy the ability to either glean information, read for pleasure, but they depend on that early reading. Now, that doesn't only apply to a language class, right? No matter what class they're in, whether it's math or history or science, they're presented with text that they need to be able to make sense of. So they have to decode it initially, but obviously, comprehension is the ultimate in reading. So they need to be able to do that decoding in order to be able to fully glean information and like I said, read for pleasure. And it doesn't end at the end of high school, right? I
Mhm.
mean, we live in a literate world. In order to fully benefit and profit from the world around us, we need to be able to read. We need to be able to fill out job applications, read information, read books that are of interest to us, whether it's a hard copy or a digital text. So we live in a literate world.
Mhm.
So in school to thrive academically, but also post school. And, there are unfortunately really negative consequences for kids who don't develop that early skill of reading.
In my work, I've collaborated directly with hundreds of educators to support their success. Do you know which of their edtech frustrations comes up time and again? The sheer number of tools out there and the difficulty of knowing which ones schools like theirs are using to get results. IXL is different. Not only does it perform the functions of dozens of tools, it's currently delivering results for 1 in 4 U.S. students, including those in 95 of the top 100 districts. Another major pain point that comes up: when a school is excited to implement a new tool only to find out the teachers hate it. Yikes. It helps to know that IXL is loved and trusted by more than 1 million teachers, saving them time on prep work while enabling them to better support student learning. IXL is research proven to accelerate achievement. Studies across 45 states show that IXL schools outperform non IXL schools on state assessments. And independent research from Johns Hopkins University verifies that IXL meets ESSA Tier 1 standards. With those results combined with IXL's teacher friendly reputation, what more could you ask for? If you have a goal to increase achievement for all students, make sure to find out what IXL can do for you. Visit IXL.com/BE for a demo. That's IXL.com/BE. Right. Yeah. And you can think about across subject areas how it would be, in most cases, impossible for a student to demonstrate what they know in a particular area without reading and writing ability.
And then you said writing is also our ability to
Mhm,
communicate what we know to people who are not directly in front of us.
mhm,
So not only do I have to read, but then I have to write. So I have to
right,
encode the words. I have to map those sounds onto the letters so that I can communicate with people who are not directly in front of me. And that's critically important because in the world that we live in the world that we're going into, we're not going to be working in offices in many cases, with people directly in front of us where we can go to them and tell them what we have to say. A lot of it is going to be through other forms of written communication.
mhm.
So, the art of writing and reading is essential for students and for post high school university life.
Yeah. So to bring about a system of schooling in which every teacher is prepared and equipped to be on the hook for doing their part with respect to reading instruction, what changes should be happening from the current status quo in pre-service teacher education and then in service learning?
Sure. Great question. So, as I teach a graduate course at McGill University in reading, and we talk about the big five of reading. That has to be essential in all undergraduate classes, education classes, or anyone who is going to be working in the field of education, teaching kids how to read. There needs to be that essential course in how kids learn how to read, how to teach kids how to read, how to identify kids who are at risk. So, that has to be an absolute essential course for all teachers as a
Mhm.
an undergraduate course. Shouldn't be able to graduate with a bachelor's degree in education without a course on how to teach kids how to read. Within a school environment, I'm a huge proponent, a huge believer in the impact of effective leadership.
Mhm.
So, wonderful schools have wonderful leaders, and the leaders really set the vision for the school. So, a leader that sees literacy as, the optimum, the, ultimate importance, critical skill for all students to master, really sends that message to everybody in the school. It's
Yeah.
not the responsibility of the kindergarten, grade one, grade two teacher. It's everybody's responsibility. That becomes sort of part of the vision and mission of the school. And therefore, resources are devoted to that, making sure that all teachers feel comfortable. And again, we're not talking about, K to two teachers. We're talking about all teachers, all grades, recognizing the importance of literacy and the role that they have to play, whether it's a third grade teacher or a 12th grade teacher, their role in making sure that kids, so the leadership making sure that it's a priority and therefore resources in the school to make
Yeah.
sure that we're up on the literature, that everybody is aware of the evidence, the plethora of research on how kids learn how to read.
Yeah. Is it what's most typical now? Is there just not universal pre-service learning on reading instruction? Is there a lot of the focus that's on alternative practices, right, that aren't really based in the evidence? What's happening most typically?
So, it depends. It depends on the university. It
Mhm,
depends on the school. I don't think there's sort of one hard and fast rule. Some universities have very solid courses on how to teach kids how to read. I would say if you're interested in a degree in education, do your research and
mm,
make sure that the university that you're going to does have a focus on teaching pre-service teachers how to teach reading. So again, it depends. Some do, some don't. And the same thing with schools. Some schools have, focus really significantly on making sure that they focus, that they teach teachers how to teach reading, that they do a lot of professional development on evidence-based practice. It depends. It really depends on the school. In some schools, they still are of the belief that there are different ways to teach kids how to read. They're sort of stuck in past decades where there were, different beliefs. One of the things that I worry about is people have philosophies about education. And based on those philosophies, they sort of allow teachers, and teachers should be, should be able to demonstrate the art of teaching. I say teaching is both an art and a science. So all teachers should bring their character, their personality into teaching. But there's a science to teaching reading, just like there's a science to teaching anything, right? And we have to make sure that we don't get stuck on a philosophy because it's something that we believe, and therefore we teach everything according to that philosophy, versus the philosophy should be the research. What does the research say about how kids learn how to read? There is so much great research out there. Let's use the research, and let's make sure that based on that research, we're teaching our teachers, we're giving teachers the opportunity to learn without, without that pressure of you got to get it right away. So allowing teachers to take risks, to try out new evidence-based practices, to get the support that they need, and all throughout the process to make sure that that vision is front and center. We believe, one of my favorite sayings is great leaders wear their vision like clothing. So if your vision is the importance of literacy, you walk into the school, you see it everywhere. You see it on the walls, you see it in the classrooms, and you allow teachers the opportunity to learn most effectively how to teach kids how to read.
Yeah. And I imagine too that it's always worth some ongoing professional learning and reinforcement, and of course to maintain consistency to make sure that every new teacher that comes into the building in a given year is receiving the same learning.
I'll just add one other thing
Yeah.
to that. If you have to make sure in a school environment, that we use only research-based practice.
Mm.
That's critical. So, in some schools, there's a belief in old models of literacy, like balanced literacy. And, we may get into that in the questions, but it's important that we base our instruction on the research, and not, I think that this is the best way to teach kids how to read because, it's a belief system that I have. So we have to move away from models of teaching reading that are just not founded in the research, not based on the research.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's multiple explanations, but it does make me wonder what are the reasons why paths diverge? Why, why evidence-based practices that have existed for a long time that are proven to work, kind of come in and out, and different ideas take hold, and I imagine that sometimes at least there might be the appearance that a different way works because some kids just have an easier time learning to read than others, so it may not be anything that the teacher did that worked. It's just that those kids learned how to read. But in other cases, you know education, most people would say it's immune to too much progress and innovation, and yet I still think in most areas of society there's the assumption that our knowledge base is always expanding and that we should know a different way now than we used to know. And sometimes that just means that we have reinforcement that the other way works, or there could be other things that change just contextually and culturally, and a learner in a classroom in the 2020s has a different environmental experience than a child in the 1950s, but their brain may still learn reading the same way. And so there could be other things that a teacher does differently, but that doesn't mean the instructional practice change. But I wonder, if you have thoughts on why there's inconsistency in sticking to a practice that is proven to work.
So a whole bunch of different reasons, right? But just to identify some, I think, so I'm Canadian, I'm not American, but I think that there are some political challenges. I think a lot of it has to do with where it came from. There was the President's Council in the early 2000s, where, researchers, educators combed through the research to identify best practices. How do kids learn how to read? And I came up with the big five. In addition, again, if you look at the research today, the research still maintains that here are the big five of reading. That hasn't changed, but I do think that there's some political elements to it, where it came from, who promulgated the desire to look at the research. And so I think there is some of that. I also think probably a more significant reason, and I think this relates to a lot of the challenges we have in education. We forget that kids are 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, and they're not us. They
Mhm.
don't have our adult brain. And so what I mean by that is, I think one of the reasons we got into trouble with different approaches to reading is we thought that kids' brains were like us, right? We thought that because reading, decoding as an example, is for sure boring for an adult. Adults know how to read. So
Sure.
I think we sort of imposed our own beliefs as an adult. We
Mhm.
forgot what it was like to be 6 learning how to
Yeah.
read. And we're saying, well, I'm an adult. I love to read. How could we break it down to sounds and letters? That's just so boring for kids. So we sort of imposed our adult love of literacy on the brain, the mind of a 6-year-old. And we said, well, they must be bored. Of course they're not bored. They're 6 years old. This is completely new for them.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
that was one sort of pathway to ineffective practices, by saying things like, we're going to expose them to great text. Of course, we need to expose them to great text. That goes without saying. But in order for them to read, they need to map letters to sounds. And there's
Yeah.
there's no escaping that. So part of it, and I think that applies to other areas of education also. There's a great concept called the expert blind spot, which is the better you are at something, the more difficult it is to teach it to somebody who is new to the learning, because you make the assumption that other people know what you know, right?
Right.
And that's a faulty assumption.
Yeah.
So we need to think like the 6-year-old, the 12-year-old, the 14-year-old, and not assume that they see, whether it be reading or the math example, the way that we do.
Yeah.
So I think that's a reason why in many cases we deem these things boring. They
Yeah.
may, the elements, learning how to do something may be boring for us, but it is the essential building blocks to learning.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting that you say that because in another episode I recorded that actually I believe is going to publish a couple of weeks after this one, but with Noreen Bunt, also about the science of reading, that was a question that I asked was, this sounds basically like these fundamentals are boring. And is that part of the reason why teachers are looking for other ways to do it? Because it's more interesting to teach, you know, a variety of texts and things and get away from the fundamentals that students can't keep up with. And to your point, reading in particular being such a foundational skill, but something that I don't remember how I learned how to read, right? I was too young at that time to have those permanent memories, like things that you learned later on that you might remember better. And so for teachers, and especially those early year teachers, that's why people who know how to teach children or are a special breed, because you have to be able to persevere through that, stick with the fundamentals, be persistent, and also relate to the mind of that learner and understand that this is a challenge for them. It might
Right.
seem super simple and it might be frustrating because these things are, to our minds, we basically have no direct way at this point of comprehending why this is something that takes a while to pick up. And yet, if we rush past it or think that there's another way, and also, the same thing with that, certain kids just pick up reading, right? And,
Yeah.
and so it can be misleading based on that to think, well, whatever worked over there works over here. And
Right.
the reality is that for all subject areas and for all kinds of fields and domains and paths of expertise, there's certain people who just pick them up. And it's not really about who taught them or how they taught them. Certain people just have aptitudes, but that doesn't apply to most of the population.
Right.
And so it
Absolutely.
really, yeah.
Yeah. But I would say everybody needs to learn how to read, even
Mm,
those who, have an easier time at it. They've learned how to map letters onto sounds. But I also think that, two important things to mention. One is that reading doesn't end, like I said, at the end of grade two,
right.
but the high school teacher is also a reading teacher. So I have to make sure that, kids in my math class know how to comprehend the math problem. Kids in my science class know how to make sense of expository text so they can read
Mm,
it and understand it, and history text, etc. So that's, one important. The reading doesn't end, and that's why, every teacher is a reading teacher. The other reason that why I think it's difficult is because, and why teachers may lean in another direction is, it's really hard to be standing in front of a group of students and being asked to do something that you never learned how to do.
mhm,
So, we ask teachers
right.
to, if we're saying, listen, you got to teach the basics of reading, phonemic awareness, phonics, but if you've never learned how to do that, but here you are in front of a group of, 7-year-olds, that's tough. That's not an easy thing to do. I need to believe in my capacity to teach kids how to read, which means I need how to learn how to
Mm,
teach kids how to read.
yeah.
So we've got to invest in that.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that myself in professional learning with certain things, where when I know that I'm going to have to explain to somebody else how to do it, if it's something I know how to do, but I just learned how to do it through experience, that I have to go and read some resources and say, all right, what's a 4-step model for describing this to somebody else, so that they know that I know and that they can pick up on it, because I just know how to do it. But I might not know the jargon or the terminology that would make it sound like, oh yeah, this guy really knows. But it totally relates, and it also makes the case for why there needs to be universal pre-service and then hopefully in-service teacher learning on this, because I think, I mean, I it's not in every school, but in a lot of cases, that there's too much pressure put on reading instruction too early for a lot of kids as young as 3 and 4, because I just believe that if a kid by the time they're in kindergarten already develops the self-conception that they're not as smart as their peers or not as capable, I think that sticks with them. But at the same time, if we have teachers who are in the middle school and high school grades who have never learned anything about teaching reading, and they have kids who are struggling to read in their classes, and it's just like, okay, if these kids haven't learned to read by now, they're basically just going to struggle in school forever, because now nobody knows how to teach it anymore. And I do have clear memories of being in 8th grade social studies class and having a kid, their turn to read a page in class, and they couldn't read it, and it was just like the whole class just stopped. And
And by the way, it was traumatic for those kids.
right.
Just
And what was that kid
that was
feeling? And
traumatic.
now what was that kid getting out of the class? But
Yeah.
it wasn't like, I doubt it probably led to anything. I don't know. I mean, but I don't know that there was a infrastructure in place to say, okay, well, these kids obviously are unable to participate fully in this class, because if they can't read the textbook, they can't do the homework, they can't
Right.
do the read alouds. It's not, and but if that teacher was trained and always taught at those grade levels, and potentially never received any learning in this because it wasn't assumed to be part of their you know area of
Responsibility.
coverage, then it's not, because we do know that based on the data, at least at this point, at least until we get to the theoretical future where 100% of kids are proficient at reading by a certain level, it just creates a system whereby some of them are just destined to fail
Right.
if
And you can
nobody's at.
learn how to read really at any point.
Mhm.
You bring up so many different points, important points. One is, like I said, you could teach a student to read at any age. However, we need to do early assessments, which doesn't mean labeling kids.
Mhm.
Let me take a step back. The first thing that you mentioned is when kids learn how to read. So there is a trajectory. It's not as if kids, well, you're not reading in grade 1, we'll wait till grade 2. That's very problematic. What we need to do is make sure in the early years, from the moment they're born, basically, they're exposed to lots of great books and language, and people are, talking with them and to them, and they're exposed. They have great exposure to language and to books, but books in terms of this is a fun, beautiful thing for us to be doing. When they're in preschool, nursery school, we need to be working on the skills like rhyming, so they don't know that we're teaching them, right?
Right.
It's fun, but we're reading them loads of rhyming books, and we're working on breaking words into their parts in the most fun way. But it is a critical pre-skill, and that's the skill of phonological awareness. By the time they get into kindergarten, we need to know what benchmarks they need to be hitting at different points. When they're in kindergarten, again, we need to be, they need to be able to break words into their sounds. And then by the end of the year, know the names of the letters to a certain extent. And in grade 1, really focus on the mapping the letters to the sounds. And, we move up in that way. And of course, comprehension, vocabulary, critical all the way through. So there is a trajectory that I think teachers need to be aware of, and we should be. When I say assessment, I don't mean psychoeducational assessments, I don't mean IQ tests, I mean just reading assessments that are
Yeah.
quick and indicate to us whether or not kids are hitting their benchmark.
Yeah.
So that's one important piece. When kids are in, like you said, 8th grade as an example, right? First of all, I hope, and I know the practice was getting kids to read out loud. I hope teachers no longer do that. First of all, I don't know what the value is.
Yeah.
Kids who are great readers are great readers. Kids who are poor readers, it's just absolutely traumatic to have to read out loud. I think kids should be reading all the time, but we have to find better ways of doing that. And there are loads of great skills that I speak about in my book about how to teach the big 5 and how to teach skills about each one. But what I do think, if you're an 8th grade teacher and you could fully benefit from the class if you're struggling to read, there are lots of ways that we can accommodate to your needs. We put the
Mhm.
book on text, but that doesn't mean that you're learning how to read. So we have to accommodate while you're in the class, but the 8th grade teacher should be, yelling from the rooftop. Somebody has to help this kid learn how to read.
Right.
And I don't mean to say that the science teacher has to become the reading teacher. I don't even mean to say that the 8th grade English language arts teacher has to go back to decoding. But we have to all be able to advocate for those kids and say, somebody has to go back to the basics with this kid and teach them how to decode, because there are
Right.
kids in 8th grade and 9th grade, there's a handful of them that are not proficiently decoding text.
Right. Because if you are the science teacher in that case and you give a test, what what grade can you honestly give the kid other than incomplete? Right?
Well,
Because I don't
there's
know.
different things. You
Because
could, for sure, but you could provide accommodations. So you could, provide automated text for that test. So the child is hearing the questions being read out to them. So that would be considered an accommodation, which is totally fine and necessary. So the child is not disadvantaged, right? They probably have great knowledge, we can
right.
imagine, in the content, they just can't access the text. So we provide accommodations, but at the same time, we have to teach that child how to read.
Right. Excellent. So let's go to the big 5 that you referenced, and for listeners who aren't familiar with this, or it's always worth a refresher, it's phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension. Are there when we look at the percentage of students who struggle to read, are there particular, areas of these big 5 that are it's more heavily weighted toward or not so much?
Well, most of them are building blocks that
Mm.
build on the other. Not all
Yeah.
of them. For example, vocabulary, you start from the moment you're born, whereas phonics depends on phonemic awareness. Fluency depends on proficiency with phonics. So if you struggle early on with phonemic awareness, it is going to have an impact on your ability to decode and read fluently. Comprehension is an important one because in order to understand what you're reading when you read it, I have to be a fluent reader.
Right.
So what happens after I've mastered decoding, hopefully with good teacher support, I become a fluent reader, which means I'm no longer decoding, which
Yeah.
means that if you look at a word, you cannot not read it because it's moved to a different part of the brain. That will
Sure.
only happen after you've mastered decoding.
Yeah.
So one really depends on the other, and that's why every teacher depends on every other teacher to do their work effectively so that you can do your work effectively, right? These things really are building blocks.
And so, of course, there's instructional strategies that relate to each of these five, and there's many of them. So, we won't get to all of those today, but maybe it's worth, highlighting one or two that are really compelling, or ones that are either really key, or that more teachers should be using, just to start to give an idea of, okay, here's some of the strategies to be aware of. Here's some that you may have done before and not necessarily realized it was, based in the science here, or others that you may not have tried, or you may have heard somebody say don't do that. That it's, worth kind of giving that context, and that also lets listeners know more of what they can dive into in the book as well. So, maybe we can go one at a time. Phonemic awareness as the first, to just kind of, what's a strategy or two that really address that.
Sure. So phonemic awareness is the ability to break words into their phonemes. A phoneme is a sound, an isolated sound. So phonemic awareness is essential because in order to map letters onto sounds, you have to hear the word and recognize that in a word is made of individual sounds so that later on I can map the letter to the sound. So one strategy, Elkonin boxes is a great strategy. I talk about it in the book where we present words to kids and we give them these boxes and you can give them a poker chip or a car and you're constantly working on, put a car for each square that represents a sound that you hear. And keep in mind, phonemic awareness is done basically as if with your eyes closed because you're
Yeah.
not reading the word, you're hearing it. So we give students, CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant words. We give them these squares and we say, I want you to put down a car for each individual sound that you hear. Another very good strategy, again, this is all about breaking words into their parts. Another good strategy is we give, you could clap out 3 different sounds. So I could clap, snap, bang. And then I say to the student, how many sounds did you hear? And they're going to tell me 3. I heard a clap, a bang, and then I map a phoneme onto those sounds. So, it becomes d, ah, g. So what I'm doing is I'm helping them break the word into sounds. They recognize what an isolated sound is, and I want them to be able to break that word into these isolated sounds. So those are 2 strategies that work very effectively, but we need to do them on a consistent basis. I mean, almost to the point where a child says, I want to go to the bathroom, and you're saying, okay, how many sounds do you hear in? I want to
Yeah.
take a drink. Great. We're constantly immersing them in that ability to break words into their isolated sounds.
Yeah. How about phonics?
Phonics. So phonics is the mapping of a letter
Mhm.
or a grapheme because, TH represents one isolated sound, which we call a grapheme. So the strategy that I think is one thing that we really, really need to do away with is asking kids to look at the picture to identify the word. So if they're trying to decode the word dog, so again, we're mapping the letter to the sound, and now we're asking them to decode. If we show
Right.
them a picture of a dog and they're struggling to decode the word, and we say to them, look at the picture, we are asking them to do the exact opposite of what they should be doing. We're encouraging them to guess, and we
Yeah.
don't want them to guess. It's called decoding for a reason, it's a code. So a strategy that works really well is something like Jolly Phonics or She's Alphabet, where in Itchy's alphabet, every letter is represented with a visual picture. So there's a forest for the F, there's an apple for the A, and it's built into the letter. You sort of have to see Itchy's alphabet. But for all kids, because Itchy's alphabet is great for everybody, but for kids who have particular difficulty remembering the sounds of the letters, you show them the image. So they see the letter A, they remember that A is sort of built into the apple. So I have a picture of an apple, but I build it into something that looks like an A. So when they see an A, what comes to mind is an apple that brings them to an A sound. A mountain that's in the form of an M, they see the M, they remember the mountain and brings them to the sound mm. And there's also a sequence that I talk about in the book, the most effective sequence to teach, one letter at a time.
Yeah.
So that's phonics.
Excellent. Yeah, phonics. That is one. I mean, not as an educator myself, but then I think I've kind of observed and tracked the ups and downs of fidelity to teaching phonics and practices, and remembering when it
Totally.
was a standard part of reading instruction, and then when schools stopped doing it, and you know, and it's, as you described, right, really an important thing to master, but for whatever reason, just not everybody stuck with it. And how about vocabulary? I'm guessing schools do teach, but maybe you don't teach it well enough, or, as I was thinking about in a recent conversation, stop teaching it at elementary level, when it's something we could all continue to keep building on.
So yes, we of course teach vocabulary. I think the problem is that we don't teach it explicitly enough.
Mm-hmm.
So there are three tiers of vocabulary. Tier one is sort of everyday language that you pick up through conversation, watching TV. Tier two is academic words, but words that you would learn through, not specific to a discipline, but common academic language, like words like increase, decrease, cause, of not necessarily connected to a discipline. And then tier three are very discipline specific words like mitosis.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to explicitly teach, we should focus on those tier two and those tier three words, but very, very explicitly. So, we should be teaching a word a day, like literally specifically, going to what words kids need to know. There's lots. You can go on Flocabulary. It's a great site. It has, well, here are the third grade words. And, very, very specifically, images are great. So use an
Mm-hmm.
image to indicate the word. Give kids lots and lots of practice with words. You have to use a word 16 times to be able to actually have developed proficiency with that word. So pick a word a day, show them pictures about that word. So, the example I give is a trestle. So I can show you a table that's held up with a trestle. I could show you a bridge, but I'm going to show you pictures, so that will help or facilitate your, the development of proficiency with the word. And then teach them the word, let them use the word 16 times. So
Right.
they go out to recess and, in a fun way, they use the word with one another. And then you're constantly repeating the words in the classroom. You could put words in a bag and every day take out a word and have them make sentences with those words that they've learned, but very, very explicitly. Make sure that they're building their third grade, fourth grade, eighth grade, 10th grade vocabulary. And anyway, that's a critical. There's others, but those are some things to be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly, I mean, one of the important things, you said a word a day, that there's young times at young childhood development where that's natural. It's like, oh, they're picking up all these words, but then at some certain point, we stop prioritizing that when it's still possible. It's
And we have to
possible to really
prioritize
do
different
that.
words. Right now,
Right.
it's not, yes, of course, we build everyday language, but now we have to move into the academic language
Mm.
and the discipline specific language.
Right. We're thinking about it in terms of, you said, this being, everybody's business, that what are the vocabulary terms that are relevant in different subject areas that need to be explicitly and proactively taught to make sure that during classroom discussions and things that kids can follow along, right? It's a sort of a time
Mhm.
when any, any kid who's not proficient in that academic vocabulary is having the experience of what it's like for a second language learner who is struggling, that who is missing parts of classroom discussion and things because there's certain words they don't know. And again, that eventually that comes up right in those subject areas, but there might be certain terminologies that are just critical to being able to discuss the subject and understand that may not seem like the key terms. That's like, let's make sure that everybody knows these and understands these and can use them. And how fluency.
Fluency. So fluency is the ability to read quickly without error and with proper prosody or cadence. So fluency depends on decoding. So once you've sort of developed proficiency in your ability to decode, now you have to be able to read quickly without mistakes so that now all your focus is going to go on comprehension of the text. You're no longer sort of battling to read each word. Now you look at the word and you no longer have to decode it. And the strategy for that is a pretty simple one. It's just, it's a fancy word is, neurobiological, printing in your brain. That's a fancy word, but really it's just repeated reading. So you give your students a text to read. The
Mhm,
text has to be at their proficiency level. So regardless of what grade you're in, you could be in 8th grade, but you're at a 5th grade reading level.
mhm,
You would need to get a 5th grade text and you read that same text over and over. Now, again, you've developed proficiency in decoding. You're not struggling to read the word. Again, you know the sounds of the letters, but now I have to make sure that it becomes fluent. So I give them a text to read. That text is at their proficiency level. So it's easy to do an assessment and see what their proficiency level is. And then I have them read that same text 5 times a day, the same text for 60 seconds. So they read it, then they go back to the beginning, read it again. And if we do that every single day with our students, and we should do it certainly with all kids until the end of 8th grade, again, except for the kids who are really fluent readers, but the vast majority of kids are going to need that. There is about a word to 2 words improvement
yeah,
each. So they'll read 2 words more on, a Wednesday than they read on a Tuesday if we follow that practice of repeated reading. So really effective and essential, and teachers, starting in even 2nd grade for those basic words that they've decoded, we should be continuing to work on fluency.
yeah. How would a teacher talk about that with the student to get the student to stick with it?
Hmm. For a strange reason, I'm not sure exactly why, kids seem to love working on fluency.
Mhm,
So teachers that do this in class for like 10 minutes a day, teachers walk in and the first thing the kid, like, are we doing that thing today? Are
mhm,
we doing, they love it. First of all, they're reading to a partner. So one reads and then the other reads. And again, I, talk about it more in the book, but that practice where you read the text 5 times a day and then your partner reads the text 5 times a day, kids just really seem to love it.
yeah.
Again, unclear why, maybe because they're working with someone else, and also they see the improvement every single day.
And so comprehension, the big one.
The big one, the
They're all
most
big, but
important, they're all big, yeah, and they all sort of so we have to differentiate between comprehension and reading comprehension. Comprehension means your ability to understand text,
yeah,
regardless of who reads it. Reading comprehension is your ability to read and understand the text when you read it. So I could have strong comprehension skills, but that doesn't mean that my reading comprehension is strong.
yeah,
How do I know that? For example, if you're working with a student and they're unable to answer questions, you then read the text to them and they're reading, answering the questions, have no issue understanding. The issue is not comprehension. It's
yeah,
the decoding or the fluency that's getting in the way. Whereas when kids are reading well, there are some kids, whether you read it to them or they read it by themselves, they have difficulty understanding the text. And that's where we know the focus is on comprehension. So we need to be focusing on comprehension for all kids. starting from the minute they walk into school, and even, when we read them, when we read, books to young kids, we're constantly focusing on comprehension. We need to continue that for kids, even in early grades. We need to read to them and work on some of these comprehension strategies. But certainly for students in the higher grades, the high school, middle school, high school grades, we need to devote a very significant amount of time to comprehension. We have to focus on expository text. We spend a whole lot of time reading narratives, but in high school, most of what they need to read and understand is fact-based. So starting in the early grades, we need to focus more on fact-based text. And there are so many different comprehension strategies that, we can teach them. One is reciprocal teaching, where we teach them how to summarize the text, ask themselves questions, predict what the text is about. And another is Adler's close reading, where we teach them to read the text 3 times, and each time they have a different focus of the text. So first, get the big idea. Second, we teach them to understand how the text is structured, what the pattern is it, compare and contrast, problem solution. And then the third reading is to make connections. So they're very, very explicit and specific strategies that teachers need to employ from the time kids are very young, when you'll be reading to them and using these strategies, to high school classes, where a very significant amount of time needs to be devoted to teaching kids how to understand. And a lot of the text that they read, like I said, is expository, fact-based text.
Yeah. So at a high level, then, what, can teachers expect to change once they've committed to and they're using these approaches for teaching? I mean, other than the obvious, kids will learn how to read better, but what changes about teaching and learning in the classroom environment once we're, teaching reading the right way?
Yeah. So, I mean, a great question, and probably something we can talk about for a very long time. But l- I think life becomes a lot more fun for teachers. There's a sense of efficacy. They feel like they're now able to open up this world for kids that is a fascinating world. So I think just the whole concept of teacher efficacy.
Mhm.
I think, but I know from the research that there is a high number of kids who exhibit behavior problems, when in fact the problem is that they can't read. So you gave the example of that student you remember in 8th grade who was asked to read. These are the kinds of kids who will act out to get kicked out of the class, because there's nothing more
Mhm.
humiliating than being asked to read. They know something's not right. Even young kids look around, and you mentioned, like, academically they feel so bad about themselves. So you see a significant decrease in behavioral challenges. So teachers have a greater sense of efficacy, just feel better about teaching. You see a reduced number of behavior problems because kids are not having to mask the fact that they can't do something. And then we are more efficiently, we're really working as a school community, because these are a series of building blocks. And we're all working together to make sure that the next year's teacher is going to have a class that of students who can thrive, academically, socially, and behaviorally.
Yeah.
So, again, like you said, besides the obvious, school is just a much more fun, better place for teachers and kids.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a good goal.
Who
So,
could who could
listeners,
argue that, right?
yes. So, listeners, the book is called The Power of Effective Reading Instruction. It's available from Solution Trio, wherever you get your books. And Karen, you also have the website, which is teachingmeanslearning.com. Is there anything in particular people can check out on the website or anything else?
So I would say that, yeah, I'd mentioned this, the power of effective reading instruction is the first. The second book was Solution Tree. Evidence-based practice is the first, and you'll see the title, but it focuses on evidence-based teaching practices. So you can look up those, and hopefully purchase them and learn more about evidence-based practice and teaching kids how to read. And there are other podcasts there, and different things about evidence-based teaching practices for teachers and for school leaders.
So everyone will put those links below to make it easy for you to find all of that. And, if you heard the end of this conversation, I mean, having a classroom where things are more fun for everyone, that's a pretty good goal. And so check all of this out. If you want to make that happen in your classroom, please also do subscribe to The Authority. If you haven't already, we have more author interviews coming your way. We have this series going on right now on literacy for National Literacy Month, but also many more on leadership and everything else that you can want to know about in education. You can visit bpodcast.network to learn about all of our shows and find more episodes on literacy plus many other topics, or visit rif.org to learn about reading is fundamental. Karen, thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
Do you want to simplify your school's technology, save teachers time, and improve students' performance on state assessments? You can do it all, but don't waste another minute. Head straight to ixl.com/BE to learn how IXL's research-proven teaching and learning platform can help you achieve all of these goals. That's ixl.com/BE.